Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, ou bonsoir, if you're with Martin in France or in the UK. We are delighted to be talking to Martin Walker about his 14th novel for Bruno, Chief of Police, the first one of which, a book totally dear to my heart, published in 2009. So Martin has faithfully produced essentially a book a year. And cookbooks, which we will talk about because that's kind of a sore spot with us here in America, since right now, curse it, we don't yet have an American or at least an English language edition. Well, actually, Martin, let's update the cookbook before we talk about the coldest case.
Well, the cookbook is coming out next year in English. We have not just translated it from the original. Julia and I, my wife and I, have redone it pretty much from the beginning. We've rewritten large chunks of it. We've changed some of the menus around, and it's really going to be an English American version of the Perigord cookbook. I think it's coming out in the fall of next year, but before that, Knopf are going to be bringing out a collection of the Bruno short stories, for which I've written about half a dozen new ones. So there'll be that to come. And then I've got I'm just about finished with the book that comes out next year. So I try and keep ahead of things. And for all of the problems of COVID, it certainly helped us do that.
Well, that's for sure. We've all had more time to stay home and read or work, as the case may be. Well, this is very exciting news. And one reason I asked about the cookbook is that as a preview, because Martin's in France and he can't actually sign the coldest case, we have created a wonderful recipe card with a dish that Bruno cooks in this book. It's a wonderful dish with pumpkin, which actually, what do we call it here in the States? We probably don't call it pumpkin. It's probably some kind of squash.
I guess you do, yeah. I mean, I've always thought of pumpkin in connection with Cinderella. You know, when the pumpkin turns into a coach. Do you tell all of your kids when you read this story that the squash turns into a coach?
No, actually, we stick with pumpkin, which we think of as so American with this nice round orange shape and the whole bit. But you also indicate that you can make this with celeriac, right?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, celeriac is celery is a wonderful vegetable, but celeriac root is very, very tasty. And one of the things I never thought would happen to me, Barbara, is that. I've always been an urban type, a city boy. I never thought I'd become a gardener. I never thought I'd start raising chickens and pheasants and making my own wine and stuff. But Perigord has that kind of effect upon you.
Well, it absolutely does. I mean, as you know, I've spent a lot of time there, and I was seduced by the Route des Noix because I'm really fond of walnuts. How can you not love a place in which you can drive around on a walnut route, sort of like the River Spey and the Scotch route in Scotland? And I'm extremely fond of foie gras. I don't care if it's politically correct or not. And confit de canard, which I was happy to say I ran across, believe it or not, Martin, in a salad in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So somehow it seems to have crept into Southwestern cuisine.
There we go.
Yeah.
And one thing with foie gras, people always complain that it can't be right for the livers of the geese and the ducks to be swollen. But in fact, it happens quite naturally when they take their long migration flights. They have to store their energy somewhere. They store it in their livers. It's an entirely natural process. Their livers swell 2-3 times the normal size before their migratory flights.
Well, one of the joys of reading the 14 Bruno books is the food and the wine, and Martin is a very reliable guide to all of that, partly because he's actually acquired a title in the wine industry. What do you call? You have a wonderful title, and if I remember, sort of medieval robe.
I've got more than one, but the one I'm really proud of is I'm a Grand Consul of the Consulat de la Vigne de Bergerac. But I'm also a magistrat de la Jurade de Montravel. I'm a maréchal of Duras and a chevalier of the Raisin d'Or, of the Golden Grape. So yeah, I'm sort of almost neck deep in this wine business these days, and I've had a column about it, and I'm making my own wine now.
I do know that you're making your own wine, but I think it's hilarious that a plain Mr. Martin Walker from England has acquired all these fabulous titles in France. I mean,
Take a look at this, the Cuvee Bruno, and here is Ballsack, the Basset Hound, with his Frenchman's policeman's helmet, and it's a wonderful wine, and this is the 2018. It's the best vintage yet, so I'm very proud of it.
well, that's wonderful. I'm living in hope that Martin will return to the Poison Pen, where he has launched, I think, all of his books actually in the United States next year. And if we have the benefit of short stories and cookbooks plus a novel, surely we should have wine. We'll figure out, maybe you can smuggle it in or ship it ahead or something, but I feel that we should
Well,
serve Bruno's Cuvée.
To a Facebook page called the Fans of Bruno in the USA, which is run by some people in Louisiana. They've got a wine store in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, called Philippe, which is now importing the Bruno wine for American connoisseurs.
That's wonderful. It's actually very difficult to import wine. We found this out after we visited a South African vineyard in the Franchos district and fell in love with a particular rosé. And it's hell's own job to actually bring it into the United States. You have to have somebody who's a real liquor licensed importer to do it. But this is good news, because that means we can contact New Orleans store and ship a case up here for our event, assuming we have one next year.
Let's hope so. Let's hope next year it's going to be real as well, with me being able to travel in person.
Well, yes, I certainly hope so. Anyway, back to where I was. Because Martin has not been able to sign the book, our copies all come with this wonderful large card, and it has the recipe for the pumpkin dish, which Bruno cooks towards the end of this book. On one side, and on the other side, which we'll talk about right now, there is a picture of a particular chateau. Now, I have to say that the Dordogne region, Périgord, is lousy with chateau, but this particular one is fascinating. And it's not, I don't think it's a spoiler to talk about the trebuchet and the chateau threatened by fire. I mean, it's not like anything dies. So tell us about that, because it's a really brilliant concept.
Well, I've always been fascinated by two particular chateaux in the Dordogne Valley. One of them is called the Chateau de Baynac, which was partly rebuilt by Richard the Lionheart in the late 12th century. And then it became the headquarters of the crusade against the local heretics, the Cathars. And then it was taken over by the French, and on the other side of the river was the castle of Castellano, which was taken over by the English. And these two castles glowered each other throughout the 100 Years' War. And the extraordinary thing is that Castellano, to this day, has been a kind of a museum of the arts of war. And in the summer, they organize jousts and exhibitions of swordplay by knights in armor and so on. But they've also got a whole series of medieval catapults or trebuchets, which were the artillery of the Middle Ages. They were mainly used to hurl great rocks against the castle walls to try and knock them down, which was the best they could do in the 8 days before gunpowder. But I got interested in this, and I talked to the people at Castellano who were running these catapults, and I found that some of these machines were so powerful they could throw a stone of half a ton up to 300 or 400 yards. And indeed, in Britain recently, a group of enthusiasts built their own trebuchet, and they managed to fire a small car for over 400 yards. And it wasn't just the catapult effect itself, but they steadily learned to put weights upon a kind of a wheel which would steadily increase the force. And this was something later that was used by Leonardo da Vinci in some of his own inventions and developments. Anyway, I thought that if your castle is being threatened by a forest fire and the fire engines can't get up there to try and put it out, and the tenders can't get traction on the hillside, well, what do you do if you can start firing water at the damn thing? So, and I found that they'd actually been experimenting with this at the castle of Castellano. So I was pleased to think that we'd found a whole new way of controlling the fire hazard.
I think it's hilarious. It's like this really gigantic water pistol or a water cannon. But it was sad but interesting too, Martin, to read, because we've been threatened by wildfires
I
so
know.
seriously here in the West. And strangely enough, it's not Arizona. Well, it is Arizona, northern Arizona, but the real fire hazards have been over on the Pacific coast, which for ages have been rainy and foggy and whatever. But with this weird climate shift, it's hotter in Seattle than it is in Phoenix and drought stricken. And so is
I
California.
know.
So things are burning like mad. But I didn't realize that the south of France, or middle France, because actually we're in mid France, we're not in the south, was also torched because it was so dry. And what is it? The Sirocco out of Africa is blowing more and more dry wind in their direction.
It's partly that, but it's also climate change, I think,
Yeah.
because bear in mind we haven't just had these sort of spates of forest fires. We're also having at the same time extraordinary floods in Germany and in
Right.
Britain. I mean, we had large parts of the London Underground rail system were being flooded this summer. It's kind of hard to deny that something is going on with the climate. We're really seeing changes of unprecedented scope. And when I'm working with wine, I find that whereas 20 years ago, we'd be struggling to get 12.5 degrees of alcohol in red wine here with the Merlot grape in the Bergerac and the Bordeaux area, now it's 14.5, 15 degrees. And that's all to do with the intense summer, the shorter growing season. The grapes are getting ripe, full of alcohol, full of sugar, before the tannins and the phenols are properly right. So it's becoming a real challenge for the winemakers.
I can imagine. I was thinking about, the famous German ice wines and how difficult it would be to even have them anymore. Actually, when you go home, they are planting vineyards in England, and for all I know, in Scotland next.
The first vineyard in Scotland has opened, and
Yes.
they haven't produced wine yet, but this is unheard of. I mean, even in Roman times, they never tried to make wine in Scotland.
Well, it'll be fascinating to see how that works out. Maybe that's where these ice wines will migrate, or for all we know, they'll go on to Iceland. I can remember in 1989 making my first visit to the tip of Greenland in a place called Katortak, which is Danish because Greenland is part of Denmark, and sort of tippy-toeing around on the tundra. And how excited the captain of our ship was that we could land in Reykjavik in Iceland and sail around the top of Iceland past Akureyri instead of the normal southern route. And now
Yeah.
they're actually doing cruises around Greenland. You can encircle Iceland, and that has been so rapid. I mean, 30 years, it has changed almost completely.
Well, maybe we've been here before. Remember, about 1,000 years ago, just about 1,000 AD, the Vikings were settling in Newfoundland, and they called the area where they settled Vinland or Wineland because they were able to grow grapes there. So, as well as being able to get across from Norway all across the Northern Atlantic to North America. So maybe it's one of these sort of circular, recurrent cyclical patterns of heating periods and cold periods. We certainly know that a lot of the cave art that was produced here by prehistoric people 20,000 years ago and more was done during a particularly warm period when the conditions were much more favorable to existence.
Yeah, I've actually visited Anslemeadow, which is the Viking settlement, Newfoundland.
place.
It's very hard to get to unless you're on a ship, although it's certainly possible. And it's basically big sod houses, and it's a wonderful area. But let's talk about caves for a minute, because one of the big attractions in the area that you're writing about is Lasko, which I believe today you can only go and visit a replica of it, right? Haven't they closed down the regular cave?
Oh yeah, they closed down the original cave back in the early 1960s. It was sort of rediscovered in 1940, and even with the relatively small numbers of tourists that were coming in the 1950s and early 1960s, there was enough bacteria coming in on the breath and on the shoes of the visitors that the cave walls began to get discolored.
Right.
And the first attempts to clean them were disastrous. They were trying to use a kind of a bleach, which just destroyed the pigments. So they decided to close the original Lasko, and they made a wonderful copy, which was opened in the 1970s. And it really is a perfect copy, I have to say. And although a lot of people were disappointed that they couldn't go into the real thing, and even now you can't go in there unless you're dressed like a nuclear scientist, completely covered in white plastic with a breathing system and so on. But there are now 4 Laskos. Lasko 1 is the original. Lasko 2 is the excellent copy you can see today. And believe me, when the guides take you in with torchlight and so on, it's eerie. It just feels so right. Lasko 3 is the traveling Lasko expedition, which has gone to Canada, to the USA, to Japan, and around the world. And when there's an English language country, I go along with it to help explain. And then there's a new Lasko 4, which is a $60-70 million state-of-the-art audio-visual experience of Lasko, which I find absolutely marvelous. It's not just the copies of the cave, but also copies of parts of the cave you couldn't normally get to, way down deep, for example. So the experience of Lasko is, I just think every human being ought to see it, just to get a sense of, as Lasko, as Picasso said when he first saw Lasko, he came out of the cave and he said, "We've learned nothing in all these thousands of years. These guys are our masters." I mean, this is the first human art, and it's spectacular.
It is spectacular. I've been in Lasko too, obviously not Lasko 1, when I visited there, but the one that you referenced briefly in the book, but you don't give the name and I can't remember it. But what I remember vividly is the cave where you actually take a train because it is so long and so deep and absolutely pitch dark. What is it?
Rouffignac.
Rouffignac. Okay, I remember that.
Otherwise known as the Cave of 1,000 Mammoths, because of all the mammoths that are painted inside.
Yeah, but what you have to marvel at is that you go in so far. How in the world did they create this art when the best they could have done was to have had some sort of light source? I mean, they would have had to have brought some kind of rushlight or something.
Well, what they did, and this is something really extraordinary. For me, it's as impressive as the paintings themselves. They developed a technology which allowed them to bring in light into these white chalk-walled caves, a light that would have a flame but would not produce dark smoke that could ruin the white chalk walls and therefore kill off all the paintings. And they found that the only way they could do this was they made lamps of rendered reindeer fat, and they used juniper twigs as wick, and they lit these, and it gave a very clear light, but with no smoke at all. So that was how they had the light deep inside those caves to be able to produce the art they did.
Well, you do write about that in the book, but what I found fascinating also was what impulse overtook people who had, wandered so deep below the earth and, and then looked around and decided they were going to render paintings on the walls. And, and at that point, pitch black, and you have to ask yourself, what was the impulse behind that?
Well, I mean, the curious thing about us human beings is that many of us feel the need to try and achieve a kind of immortality through graffiti on walls, if you like, or through painting, or through making some kind of artistic statement. Or we also try and get in touch with something we don't understand, supernatural. You can call it God, you can call it the pagan forces of nature, whatever, but it's as though people want to worship. They want to feel a link to something much more powerful than their own puny selves. So I can see both of those forces at work, the religious or spiritual urge, and also the urge to create some kind of art. And it seems to me that between those two, we're defining humanity. And that's in Lasko 18,000 years ago.
There's a wonderful cave. I'm trying to think, it's somewhere near Rocamadour. It's not a painted cave, but you descend and it's got a river going through it. And that's one of my fondest memories of the Dordogne.
That's Padirac. That's
Yes.
the Gouffre de Padirac. And I know it well. Yes, you have to get into a boat to get across
Right.
into the deeper part of the cave. And it has this wonderful great hole in the top, about 300 feet above, which gives this eerie kind of light that comes down. It's an extraordinary, amazing geological formation here in the Perigord of
Yeah.
limestone and rivers that have carved out these remarkable geological formations of caves, of kettles, of great big sinkholes. There's one quite near where I live, and in the novel I call The Devil's Cave, I used this, that it was a huge space underground, and it was such a big space, it had its own microclimate. So uh, gouts of mist would regularly come out of the tiny hole in the top of this place. And the priest said to the local peasants, "These are the slopes of the fires of hell." And of course, in those days, people believed all this. And so they actually called it the Devil's Cave. It wasn't fully opened until the beginning of the 20th century, when a very intrepid guy decided to have himself lowered down upon a kind of a sling down this hole and down into the cave with its very feeble lantern that couldn't reach the hugely wide walls. And he got to the bottom. He was standing upon a heap of bones, half human, half animal. The human ones had been pilgrims who had been slaughtered by bandits when they were on a pilgrimage towards Compostela and stuffed down the hole. Amazing times.
Really is. I mean, in a way, the puff of smoke is like the Delphic Oracle in Greece, but
Yep,
Rocamadour, which is an amazing pilgrim site on the road, one of the routes to Compostela that
it
goes
is. Yeah.
across France, and it's way up high, has an enormous flight of stairs, and pilgrims used to go up it on their knees as a sign of piety, which just made my own really ache. But I mean, it's an amazing region. This is a relatively small and
Did you see the giant cross on the cliff wall?
but it's the
Because
limestone. And
remember Charlemagne when he went into invade Spain to try and liberate parts of it from the infidels. Charlemagne was accompanied by the great warrior of the day, a man called Roland, and Roland was in charge of the rear guard as Charlemagne was trying to retreat, and he was told that if he was in trouble, he should blow his famous horn, and Charlemagne's main army would come back to help. And the enemy was closing in, and all of Roland's colleagues said, "For Christ's sake, blow the damned horn!" And he wouldn't, and he finally blew the horn as the enemy was closing in with their spears. And he had this magical sword, did Roland, and he hewed it around himself, made enough of a space that he could save the sword. He hurled it up into the sky, and the legend goes the Archangel Michael himself came down, took that sword, and hurled it across the Pyrenees back to France, where it landed in the great rock face of Rocamadour. And you can still see the outline of the cross made by that sword in the cliff today. Ta-da!
I love it. I know. I mean, the whole pilgrim thing. Well, it's a whole nother discussion. I've only walked part of it, the part around Compostela, rather than, and I've been to Rocamadour, but I didn't go up on my knees. The point I was making in a roundabout way is there is absolutely no end of things that Martin can write about. And this, it's not a huge, but immensely what's the word I want? There's myriad things to write about in all sorts of historical contexts. But let's talk about Les Aisies, because another of my favorite places is the wonderful prehistoric museum in Les Aisies, which Neanderthal man had a big presence in this area because of the limestone caves, the overhangs. It was like Mesa Verde, if you want to think about it in US terms, where the Anasazi and Bandelier Canyon and so forth here in the Southwest. But anyway, Les Aisies, what is it that Bruno goes to Les Aisies and spots that really kind of kicks off this book, The Coldest Case?
Well, it begins a bit before Les Aisies. It begins And this is a real story. This begins with a neighbor of mine in my little village, a retired captain of gendarmes called Raymond, with whom I will have a little aperitif of an evening very often. And Raymond had kept on his on the wall of his kitchen for many years a photograph of a human skull. And he told the story that as a very young gendarme, when he was just learning to be a detective, he was called to a mysterious body that was found in the woods, partially buried. A storm had uncovered parts of it. And he had the body removed and taken for forensic studies. And he tried to find out how on earth this guy had died. And it was clearly a young man, a very healthy, fit young man, early 20s or so. And Raymond couldn't find any evidence. The body was pretty much decomposed, but he was sifting through the ground beneath the body to find a bullet. When they went to the post-mortem, he was trying to look for signs of a stab wound in the ribs and so on. And finally, in desperation, in these days before DNA, he persuaded the magistrate who was in charge of the investigation to allow him to boil the head, the skull, to remove all of the extraneous skin and so on and flesh, so that he could actually study the skull. And he did this, and he found that there was indeed on the right side of the skull, there was this great big crack and depression where the guy had been hit and killed by some kind of camping tool. Now, Raymond was never able to identify who this might have been, but a couple of years ago, there was a big exhibition, a special exhibition at the museum in Les Aisies, where a woman called Elizabeth Dayness was showing off her work. Now, some of you might remember a cover of National Geographic magazine in which there was the face of Tutankhamun, which had been rebuilt from the skull of this ancient Egyptian pharaoh, Tutankhamun, from his skull. She had taken the skull and rebuilt it according to the actual planes of the bones on his face. And this was widely reckoned to be a remarkable development. And she then has begun doing the same thing, recreating faces of the Cro-Magnon and the Neanderthal people, of which there are so many examples here in this area of the Périgord. In fact, there are more of these skulls and bodies that have been found here than almost anywhere else. And so this exhibition that she put on was of the reconstructed skulls of bodies that had been there for up to 70,000 years, who were finally getting a face, an image put to these mysterious skulls. I was blown away by this, as were many other people. And I thought, what if Raymond brought along the skull of Oscar, which was the name he gave to his unidentified body? Maybe in spite of no DNA, or we could then use DNA these days, and we could find out who on earth the guy was. And at that point, the idea for this novel really just burst into my head.
Well, of course it did. I mean, it's a 30-year-old skull. You know, years ago, Aaron Elkins, who wrote a wonderful series with a forensic anthropologist called Gideon Oliver, in one of his books actually had a recipe for deflensing bones, boiling them, and it involved tide. And I can't remember what else that you put in the water, but the idea being, of course, to remove, as Martin says, the, skin and hair and whatever, and just come down to clean bone to proceed. So I thought, I used to think about writing that down in case it ever became useful, but I probably could find it. So there's one thing. You also comment upon the smell, which is really unpleasant, of the boiling skull. In case any of you are thinking of cannibalism, this will definitely turn you off. But that technique, I think, is really fascinating. It's been used here in the States. We had a woman who did some programs years ago at the Poison Pen, and she also was a facial reconstruction person. But I thought the detail you went into about how, you could really work out the muscle patterns from the bones so that the face had wasn't just a mask, but really very lifelike the way she went about it.
There are 43 muscles in the face,
right,
and they are pretty much defined by the actual contours of the underlying skull. There are so many differences in human skulls that they are what give the shape to the muscles that produce our face. So, I mean, Elizabeth Dayness has really gone into this in great depth. At first, the courts here in France and the police were very reluctant to get into this, in part because they said that the most obvious ways to recognize somebody are through the color of their hair, the color of their eyes, and these are things that cannot be reconstructed. But now even the courts are starting to realize that Elizabeth Dayness has got something which can be useful in criminal justice. And,
Well, yeah, but the justice
DNA.
system has always been, dragged its heels. I mean, it didn't like fingerprints. It didn't like DNA evidence. It takes a long time to bring the legal profession current with advances in technology. And obviously we've come a long way in terms of, genetic testing. If you can find any kind of DNA and you can go to genetic databases, your opportunities for finding a match and some sort of narrowing the field for recognition. Anyway, in this book,
DNA is becoming a bit problematic. I remember back in London, the Metropolitan Police were baffled for a while when they discovered there was almost a black market in the hair clippings that you could find in barbers' salons or in hairdressers. And you could actually sell these bits of cut off hair. And they found that what was happening was that professional criminals were scattering these bits of random hair from all sorts of people all over the place of any crime scene, so that it was much, much more difficult to get any kind of DNA connection.
right?
And there was a famous case in France when they were looking for a serial killer, and they found that almost all of the corpses bore a trace that led them back to a woman who worked in a factory that made like the Q-tip things. And those Q-tips, of course, were what the forensic scientists were using to collect the DNA samples. So this woman, had actually polluted all of the Q-tips that were used to collect them. So, DNA can be outfoxed by criminals or indeed by accident.
It really can be. There's a wonderful writer from Minnesota whose first novel involved a murder scene in which the perp had emptied the entire bag of a vacuum cleaner over the body in the crime scene, so that all of the dust and litter in the vacuum cleaner basically, made it difficult. But what's interesting is that people are voluntarily, registering in DNA bases in order all these things like ancestry.com and so forth, and raising now a whole new, just as with facial recognition techniques, raising all kinds of interesting new questions about privacy rights versus justice and so forth. Anyway, what we find out in the book, in this 30-year-old murder, they're able to eventually work out who this young man, the dead man, might be. And then the question is, how did he die and who might have killed him? And it isn't really so much trying to work out who killed him, because there's like one obvious suspect in the book, but what the hell, who they were and what their background was and what that meant. And Martin, I really, as I told you when I wrote to you yesterday, I think that it's possible to say too much about that, because one of the choice, I always throw away everything that comes with a book, when I get the advanced reading copy, because I don't want anybody to tell me what I should think about it. And so as I read it, I was totally surprised. And I think it's a mistake if we give too many clues, because part of the joy of reading this book is to, travel along in the investigation with no more knowledge than the people running it had.
Yeah. And it's what I loved about this story was it allowed me to get into all sorts of bits of fairly recent modern history as well.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing about writing a novel. I mean, you can draw inspiration from 20, 30,000 years ago in prehistory with the archaeologists. And of course, your corpse has got to be modern. But the circumstances in which the corpse becomes dead often have a great deal to do with modern politics, modern crime, modern greed, and modern lust. It's the age-old story, I guess.
Well, one of the joys of reading your books, the Bruno books, is that while he is a village policeman in a relatively, in a rural area, you always manage to bring in, much larger history and a very international scope, which I put down to all your years in journalism. And, I mean, you've obviously written before because you've written various nonfiction books. You know a lot about Russian politics and French politics. I love the way you write about de Gaulle, for example. And so, these books have a much broader scope than you might think as you pick them up.
Well, I mean, yeah, a lot of it comes out of my journalistic days, the British paper with The Guardian. I was a foreign correspondent. I was based in Moscow during the Gorbachev years. I was based around the world for them. I worked in Africa, the Middle East, Moscow. I was the Washington correspondent as well. And yeah, I mean, that in a sense gave me a way of thinking about the complexities of modern crime. And then the headlines of these days are just so remarkable. When you think that, the Russian spies, Russian agents have been using nerve agents to kill nerve gases to kill somebody in a sleepy little English country town called Salisbury. When you think that Russian cyber warfare people have been targeting American elections, they targeted Macron in the French elections in 2017. This isn't widely known in the USA, but in 2017, the Russian cyber warfare people unloaded 48 hours before the election. They unloaded a massive data dump of material from the Macron campaign, including a lot of forged documents that said things like Macron had these secret bank accounts in the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands. And what they didn't know was in France, there is a law that the press cannot report anything about politics in the last 48 hours before a vote. So all of this data dump came out 48 hours before the vote, and nobody knew about it until it happened. But the result was that Macron and his entire team in France know perfectly well what the Russians tried to do to them, just as I think a lot of people in America understood the kind of impact that Russians have had upon some of your elections, and that we in Britain now know just how much the Russians were trying to influence, for example, the Brexit referendum. It's a new kind of age, and what I find interesting is to be able to, in a novel, bring together some of this modern cyber warfare with some of the ancient prehistoric Neanderthals and medieval catapults. I mean, I have great fun doing this.
Well, of course you do. I think it's wonderful. And you've also crafted some characters like Jack, for example, Jack Scarlett, who, is or was a British agent. And you've brought, and there are lots of Brits who retire to France. I mean, it's, well known that there's a very large population. So it's not implausible that you can have either retired or active spies living in this very desirable area, which allows you scope to do that. And in fact, one of the joys of the book is the whole ensemble cast, which has gotten so large, including the animals. So we have not just the basset hound, but the horse and more horses and whatever it all is. How do you keep up with all that?
Well, it's like I'm living in my own soap opera. I mean, these people are becoming
right.
quite real.
Well, yeah, you have a wonderful time, but I mean, you have to keep up with all these. You create them, and then you have to remember who and what they are. What their background is, what they look like, what their relationships were. And you can't bring them all forward. So in this particular book, there's just a passing reference to the rock star, for example, who occupied a whole book earlier. And that's fine. But how do you manage that? Do you have somebody who does continuity for you? Do you keep notebooks? Do you rely on your wonderful memory? How do you do it?
Oh yeah, this is a family affair, Barbara. Julia, my wife, whom you know, is the one who helps me with the cooking, and in fact checks all of the cookery stuff for me. She's an expert cook and a food writer. Then Kate, our eldest daughter, is the one who looks after the Bruno website. And then Fanny, the younger daughter, the poet who lives in Seattle, is the one who set up a computer program on continuity, so that I always know, who has done what, what they ate last time, and what part they played, what are their surnames, what are their families' names, and so on. So, but by putting all this together, I mean, it's a kind of a family enterprise, and I couldn't do without it.
Well, you clearly proved it takes a village to write about a village. I mean, there's no real question of that. And I hadn't thought about it, but one of the things I guess you do also have to keep track of is the food, because Bruno cooks throughout the books, but you don't want him constantly serving the same meals. And so you have to keep up with the recipes as well, don't you? We lost you there.
Hello. I lost you for a minute. Hello.
Hi, you might need to exit and come back. Are you back? You're not back. You're not back. Patrick, I think he needs to exit and return.
He might.
Yeah, because I missed all of his last conversation.
Hi, am I back?
I think so. Try it again.
We can see and hear you, I think.
Well, I can't hear him. We can see him. Martin, just drop out and reconnect.
I'm doing exactly that. Yeah.
There he is.
Oh, and he has a glass of wine. I really wanted to have a glass of wine, but I thought at noon it was a little whatever. But of course, it's 9 o'clock.
9 o'clock for me.
I know. Envy indeed. Well, anyway, before we lose Martin again, the coldest case is as always a wonderful entry in the series. The one constant, aside from Bruno and his love of his garden and his home and his village, well, there are more than one constant. The mayor continues his wonderful and adroit political savvy. I love the mayor. And Isabel, who is like the hopeless romance in this thing. Isabel has a bigger role in this book than she's had in a couple of others, because there's an international aspect to the case that comes in. So poor old Bruno, I don't know that he's ever going to get to settle down and have a family. I mean, maybe when you decide to retire yourself, you're going to retire Bruno and give him some sort of happy ending.
I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure I dare. Julia keeps telling me that the moment that I marry Bruno off, I will lose most of my readers, which would worry the hell out of me, but we will see. I'm still trying to get back on. I think we might have a problem. There's a bit of a storm going on outside, which can often be a problem.
No, you're fine. I mean, I can hear you again. We just lost part of the little bit of conversation we had there towards the end, but it's all right. Let's bring Patrick in to see if we have questions from the audience before we lose you. Patrick, any questions?
Let's see here. Hold on just a second. You almost lost me too. Yeah, I have a question. Somebody's asking if you actually write in French as well as English.
Yes, I do write in French, but not nearly as rather more clumsily than I do in English. But I do a lot of speaking in French, public speaking and so on, and TV series and TV interviews and radio. And I write for various local publications as well. So yes, I do write in French, but a bit more clumsily than I write in English, I think.
We didn't mention that Bruno is in fact a TV series, but it's in German, which I always think is amusing. That it's like Donna Leon's wonderful Italian Venetian mysteries were made by a German company, and I never could really relate the characters to Venice. They just didn't look Venetian. How do you feel about the German casting for the Bruno series? Do they feel French?
Well, I'm not really allowed to say, but I mean, I'm quite happy with it. But there is, I have to tell you, Barbara, that there is a major US streaming service that is now getting involved in this. So we're still a question of whether it's going to be filmed in English or in German or whatever. So we will see.
How exciting. And I wonder if they'll use computer assisted graphics for Ballsack or Hector, because animals are notoriously unreliable when being filmed. So it might be really an interesting concept to see how that works. I mean,
particularly when it comes to the love scene between Ballsack, the basset hound, and his pedigree mate, Diane de Poitiers. I mean, I had great fun writing that particular chapter. Of course, as you know, I shrink from having any explicit human sex scene in my book.
Canine sex as well as human sex in these books.
But
however, I'm happy to say that
sex
right. I forgot to say that Ballsack is indeed the proud father of nine puppies in this book, right. which might not only proves to be something that Bruno can perhaps give to friends, but also might produce a real income stream for him, because Ballsack and Diane de Poitiers have these incredible bloodlines. So their puppies are extremely valuable.
And do you know that the great bloodline of the Bassets is in fact one that's called the Stonewall Jackson line, which comes from the Confederate general, and his Bassets came from the Marquis de Lafayette when he came over to fight with George Washington in the War of American Independence. And he brought to George Washington a gift of 2 Bassets, a boy and a girl. They weren't called Ballsack and Diane, but there we are. That's the great line of Basset pedigrees.
I love that. Well, I mean, Bruno just has a sort of regular salary as a village policeman. So, the thought that he might actually have a financial asset aside from his enormous love of Ballsack, I think is really quite tantalizing.
Don't forget his shares in the town vineyard, which are probably going to come good. And also, Bruno doesn't spend his salary. He lives on his garden and his chickens and his hunting, and he's got very simple tastes. And the state pays for most of his clothing, uniforms. So for Bruno, money doesn't really come into it very much.
Well, it could, depending on what you decide to do down the road. Any other questions, Patrick?
Is one of Balzac's puppies named Goriot?
Le Père Goriot. No, it's not named after one of Balzac's novels. There is one that's owned by the old Scottish rock musician who appeared in the last novel for the first time in Chateau Rock. And he calls his puppy Robert the Bruce, in the name of the great Scottish king who defeated the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. So we've got a Scottish element in there now, as well as a Perigord element, and in fact the one that the novel I'm writing right now, which is coming out next year, is called To Kill a Troubadour, and a lot of it's all about these medieval troubadours who entertained the courts with their medieval instruments and their songs of King Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot and the Knights of the Round Table. I'm having great fun with this. I really am.
Wow, chanson d'amour. I love it. Oh, that sounds absolutely wonderful. Which reminds me, where is the talented cook, the wonderful lady that appeared? I thought she'd settled down in the village and she was making was it Jamaican? I can't remember. But anyway, where is she in this book? She isn't.
Oh, you mean Amélie, the Haitian girl? Well, Amélie is working in Paris for the Ministry of Justice and doing a bit of nightclub singing on the side. But she comes back in the book next year. Okay. This is the one who plays the Josephine Baker role and sings Josephine Baker songs.
Got it. All right. It's proving that I'm missing her and paying attention.
Good for you. But they all keep coming back. I never let a good character go to waste, Barbara.
That's very true. You haven't killed off anybody we really care about so far. We'll see what happens, except unfortunately for the first Basset Hound, but he was getting, unfortunately, to be so senior that he had a heroic exit.
There we go. Yeah.
Yep, he really did. I mean, you did that extremely well. It was very sad.
Well, the choice was either there was one of these tragic scenes where the dog died of old age in Bruno's arms, which
Right.
reminded me of that scene in Little Nell in Dickens's novel. And remember,
Right.
Oscar Wilde said, beats there a heart so cold that can forbear to laugh at the death of Little Nell. And so I thought the choice is either a tragic death or he dies on the field of honor, fighting for his master. So,
Yeah, which he
what would
does
anyone-
extremely well. And then we get Ballsack. What was the name of the first Basset Hound?
Gigi.
Gigi. That's
Gigi.
right.
Yeah.
You remember Monsieur Pamplemousse and his dog Pomfret?
Yep.
I do.
That was a
And,
wonderful series, and Pomfret was a glorious name for the dog.
And what was that?
Was it Michael
Colombo.
Bond? Yes, and Michael Bond was a British writer, but again chose to write with a. He was what was he? He worked for Michelin, didn't he, Monsieur Pamplemousse? I think he went around to restaurants.
The other famous cop with a Basset Hound, of course, was Colombo.
All right.
And the French people will often sort of, when they see me with my Basset, will say, le chien de Colombo. But I forget the name that Colombo gave to his Basset. Do you recall it at all?
No, I don't. No,
Ah,
I'm fixed
I'll
on
have to check
Ballsack.
Google later.
I do have a question or two here. Let's see. Pat asks, do you plot out your books, or do you just kind of wing it?
It's a bit of both. I try to plot them out, but as the writing develops, you find yourself going down little byways and things start to change, which is why I really do feel I'm very grateful to my wife and kids, who are the first readers, and my agents and my editors, who will sort of drag me back to the main theme from time to time and say, look, cut this little byway out, please. Or yeah, I mean, you get carried, if you are writing about a character or an event, you can get carried away, beyond what your plan actually says. And in one way, it's marvelous. I mean, I remember there's one novel I wrote, The Devil's Cave, and the Germans gave it a wonderful title. They called it Femme Fatale, because there is this really dangerous, sexy woman who's trying to seduce Bruno for her own purposes. And when I plotted it out, Bruno, I mean, he's just a man. He's just a guy. He falls for her evil wiles. But when I came to write this, it was like a force field was coming out of my desk at me saying, I am not going to drop my trousers for this woman. I mean, and I thought, well, he's got a life of his own. What do I do now? I have to rewrite this entire ending.
Right. How about that? Well, you're sticking to the no sex for humans or canines sort of wells. So what could you do? Yeah, The Devil's Cave was a really interesting book. They all are. And, I love the fact that you've always got this, commonality, but each book is so different and distinctive depending on various forces in play. Maybe sometime when you go off a particular interesting byway, you need to like put them on your website or compile them or something. I mean, I understand that you have to prune them for the sake of the novel, but I imagine some of them are really worth preserving.
Well, a couple of them have actually, I cut them out and they've gone into short stories.
Stories, yep, that would be the other way.
Coming out in this short story collection,
Wonderful.
Including one which is about where Bruno has to create a Neanderthal meal that is fit for human consumption, and trying to learn how Neanderthals actually cooked beyond just roasting stuff over a kind of a barbecue. And I spent a lot of time at the Museum of Les Aisies talking to experts there, and discovering things like the nutritious value of duckweed from ponds and so on, and how much we can learn about their vegetarian diet from some of the tiny little critters that then get fossilized and have remained deep in the mud of ponds and riverbanks, which the scientists have rediscovered.
So the Neanderthals were actually omnivorous. They weren't just vegetarian.
No, they were not just carnivorous. I mean, they were certainly hunting a lot. I mean, they hunted mammoth deer, cattle, but they also ate an awful lot of fish, and we now know an awful lot of vegetation as well.
Interesting.
We've had several viewers chime in to say that Columbo just called his basset hound Dog.
Ah, how unimaginative of him.
That was the dog's name, Dog.
That's the advantage of Google, Martin. It's just
Yeah.
wonderful. And Patrick often saves me because my memory is not what it used to be. And I'll throw something out in a conversation, and then Patrick gets into the chat room and he says, it's so-and-so, which is so wonderful. So thank you, viewers, for participating and helping us out. And we can't remember.
Thanks, folks.
Do you remember Steve Martin's dog's name in The Jerk?
No.
No, Shithead.
Okay.
What a great movie.
This is a family program here.
Yes, sorry.
You weren't here yesterday when Karen Slaughter and Mark Billingham were talking, and I assure you it was not a family program.
Oh dear, the standards in British journalism have gone, or British authorship have gone down a long way.
Hey, come on, we're talking about crime. We don't need to be completely lily-livered about the whole
This is
thing.
high
Although
culture,
we
too.
try to keep it clean. Anything else, Patrick?
Let's see. Somebody was asking about what kind of wine are you drinking, Martin?
Well, I was drinking a Kier, which is a mixture of white wine from a friend of mine and a little bit of creme de cassis. But now I'm having a glass of my own Cuvee Bruno. So your very good health. It's about 60% Merlot, about 30% Cabernet Sauvignon, a bit about 7% Cabernet Franc, and the rest is a little bit of Merlot, a little bit of Malbec. I always like to have Malbec because it was the wine under the local name of Cotte that was served at the wedding of Eleanor of Aquitaine in the year 1152. So here's to Eleanor.
Indeed, a really remarkable woman, made of iron, as far as I can figure out. I mean, honestly, she was truly remarkable, given
The only woman who'd been married to a king of France and a king of England, and the only queen who'd gone on crusade to the Holy Land.
I was just going to say, it wasn't so much her surviving the marriages as her surviving her travels, that I think she must have been made of iron. And she had her last child at something like 45, on the English Channel, bucketing across the English Channel and so forth. The evil Prince John of, lasting
The man
infamy.
was forced to give us Magna Carta. Yeah.
Yes, but she really was amazing. I'm sorry that I never got to know her, but not possible. All righty, Patrick, we got anything else?
I think that's about it.
Wonderful. Well, Martin, it's been an absolute pleasure. I wish I had a glass of wine. I could say à votre santé aussi.
Next time I see you, I'll bring one of my own over for you, Barbara.
That would be absolutely lovely. So, good, Patrick, there's, can you hold it up closer? This is the Chateau Castellano, that is where the trebuchet, save the day. And then if you turn it over, there is the glorious recipe for roasted pumpkin slices with sage and walnuts.
That's lovely.
Our copies of the book come, each one of them, with this wonderful card that we created. And I want to thank Martin for sending us the recipe and also a link to the chateau. So.
And thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Scottsdale and all the ships at sea.
All that, right. Au revoir, chérie.
Okay. Bye. Ciao, ciao. Big hugs.
A bientôt.
Bye.
Bye.